This is the McKinsey podcast, where we help you make sense out of our world's toughest business challenges.
Welcome to the show. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
Most parts of the world are now aging, and that means most parts of the world are going to have what's a higher dependency ratio going forward. And to support such a society, everybody working had better be generating more output per unit of labor because they have to be able to cover everybody.
That's McKinsey senior partner Olivia White. Demographics are changing, technology is changing, and so is our view of productivity across the globe. Olivia joins me and McKinsey senior partner Chris Bradley to discuss.
In our second segment, Europe is having a tough time filling many open skilled labor jobs. McKinsey senior partner Tania Holt says the answer is ethnic minority employees.
Chris, Olivia, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to be here, Roberta.
It's my pleasure to be here.
We're here to talk today about the MGI report on productivity. The firm has taken this longitudinal look at global labor productivity going back 25 years. We're going to get into the specifics, but I did want to step back for the listener and just define our terms. What does productivity measure and why is it so important?
It's actually a very simple measure, but has a lot of complexity inside of it. So the measure of productivity is just how much output, how much GDP is generated for every hour of work. And well, why does that matter? Because over the long run, it reflects two things. First of all, it reflects how good we are at an economy at doing stuff. And second of all, it's the main way by which all of the technical progress of the world, all of the capital accumulation has found its way into the main way that we share our wealth, which is through wages. And
so you can think about that as, for example, lattes pulled in an hour or in a minute, or cars that move down an assembly line in a given period of time. And it matters a ton because this is the only way that we can raise wages and living standards for people in a country or across the world.
So worldwide, big picture, what's been going on with productivity?
You know, the answer itself is really, really interesting. The first thing that happened is we had an absolute productivity miracle. The median worker of the world versus 25 years ago is now 6 times more productive.
In terms of dollars, in 1997, labor productivity measured in terms of output per worker per year was about $7,000. In 2022, $41,000. The world has grown much more productive and, as a result, at large, much richer.
But equally, it's a slowing miracle. In other words, while we have improved productivity over this point, the rate at which we're improving productivity is slowing just about everywhere. The fast lane is going slower and the advanced economies are going slower as well.
I want to explore that topic a bit more, Chris, but first I need to interrupt. So I wanted to clarify this point about this concept, this term that you used, the fast lane. Olivia, I know this is an allusion to the highway analogy that we use in the report. Can you say a little bit more about that analogy? Like, what does it mean when we put economies in different lanes at different speeds?
This is a highway with fast and slow lane with like immensely diverging speeds between these different lanes. And so just to give you a sense, fast lane economies, take an example, Poland, okay? Poland, if it kept up its pace of productivity growth that it's had over the past 25 years, it would reach U.S. productivity levels within the next 11 years or so, and China would be there in 16 years. By contrast, a place like Indonesia, which has been slow lane, would take 135 years. And other countries, say Argentina, at least at its pace of productivity growth over the past 25 years, would never get there. I mean, this is a highway in which there's some economies that are effectively going in reverse versus advanced economies. Why does it matter? 50% of the world's population consumes over 50 gigawatts of energy a year. And this is the sort of thing that both powers productivity but is enabled as a country gets richer.
Now, the middle lane are the people, there's places like Thailand, Egypt, Tanzania, where their productivity growth is not as fast as it should be given their starting point. Because remember, if you start with low capital, the incremental returns on capital should be very, very high, and you should be experiencing much higher productivity growth. It's natural. But we didn't. So that creates like our Sherlock Holmes mystery of, what's going on? It's the Middle East, it's Sub-Saharan Africa, and it's Latin America. And these places just live in a productivity shadow. And, this is one of the great tasks of the world, because we know, and one of the things we talk about in our report is we actually know the 5-part formula of what it takes to get into the fast lane. This is a knowable thing. So we've got to ask ourselves, for these billions of people in the slow lane who aren't converging, how do we, one of the biggest problems the world has to crack is how do we get them to shift into the fast lane?
Okay, so why is productivity stalling? What are some of the contributing factors?
So let's divide it into 2 sections, and that's one thing in our report we did a lot, was make sure we're looking at countries corrected for their context, and the most important context is where you started. And because the basic theory of it, as you'd understand, if you've got a very basic economy where very few people live in cities and you have very little capital, the first tractor, the first freeway, the first skyscraper has massive impact on productivity, but the millionth one less so. So the first reason is actually good news, which is places like China and India did a big leap forward and kind of caught up a lot. Now, they haven't caught up all the way, but as those economies get closer and closer to a fully industrialized economy, they are more and more limited by the same things we are in the West, which is fundamentally technical process. And so at first you can emulate, and mostly just deepen your capital. Now, capital per worker, which is the stock of capital in the US, is still way higher. It's still 3 times higher than China, right? So the US is still more productive because they've still got more of that installed capital. But that first surge, that first bit of capital, that first bit of urbanization has a massive impact on productivity. But as you'd expect, it's kind of an S-curve, right? It's an impact that slows over time. And then in the advanced economies, we point to the same thing, which is investment, but a different case. Instead of surging investment, it's actually slowing investment. And you might be saying, well, why am I talking about capital when this is a report about productivity? And that's because actually about 80% of productivity growth happens because each worker has more capital, more equipment. So in some ways, we kind of go, well, a productivity-rich world is an investment-rich world, which is quite a good, simple framing, because then it leads to an actionable question, which is, well, how do we create an investment-rich world?
That's one of the things that I wanted to get at as well. We talk about in the report doing 2 things: boosting investments and boosting digital transformation. And every conversation that we have nowadays talks about generative AI. I'm curious, when we talk about this acceleration of the digital transformation, what's the link between Gen AI and productivity?
So one aspect of whether AI and Gen AI will boost productivity is, are we deploying it? And is it in place, and is it enabling individuals to be more productive in the way that they work? But the other aspect is, are people qualified and prepared to do the jobs, to sit in the occupations that are needed in order for Gen AI to be, and AI more generally, to be integrated into the way that companies work? And indeed, are people whose jobs may become less relevant as AI rolls out, are they being retrained, and are economies helping them find jobs that will enable them to be productive on an ongoing basis? And so we can talk about the role that Gen AI can play in boosting productivity, but we'll also need to talk about, are we helping with the sorts of job transitions that will be necessary in order for that to happen, to help economies, but also to happen in a way that's inclusive and brings everybody along?
Chris, anything you'd like to add?
I guess let me talk to the waves that have happened. So, for example, in the US, in the early 2000s, we think somewhere between a third and a fifth of all of the US productivity growth was just from that electronics manufacturing boom. Then the second wave was, well, okay, we all had ubiquitous connectivity and the internet, and then digitization happened. So if you're a bank, you digitize your channels, and you did e-commerce, and a lot of interactions were digitized. And I can tell you where we saw that in the productivity statistics, and it's really simple: nowhere. And why is that? Well, if you're a kind of a supermarket chain, it's actually not 100% clear that adding an e-commerce channel radically improved your productivity. You had to do it, customers wanted it, but you had to duplicate two channels. So we're in this kind of mid-game where the digital revolution has happened, and we can see it more at an industrial level, the kind of the transformation that happened to our industrial landscape. But it hasn't yet been a productivity miracle, which leads us to the third wave, which is intelligent machines and genuine automation and Gen AI. And here we think it's different this time. We really do. Under most of our midpoint scenarios, within 10 years, about 1/3 of what we do now is automated. And that's even allowing for adoption timelines and all that stuff. So that's 1/3 of the stuff we do now kind of effectively getting done for us. And if we can redeploy that other 1/3, this is a massive productivity surge. And so why do I believe that this is different than the kind of more the standard digital technologies that came with mobile internet? It's because Gen AI is an intelligent technology that can attach itself to many, many, many existing activities. We keep getting surprised by what Gen AI should do, and we need to stop being surprised. We need to start expecting to be surprised, if that makes any sense.
But what about the concerns, Chris, that Gen AI will disrupt people's lives and livelihoods?
I think Gen AI is an interesting one because it can strike fear into people, because in the reality that it's within our lifetimes, occupations that have been with us for generations, like jobs that we think of now as being very prestigious white collar jobs, like entry level law jobs, the same will go, right?
Right.
But I don't think we should be Luddites. My sense is there's a few reasons why we should have a very open mind about this stuff. Actually, the biggest problem in economies is not unemployment, it's not enough labour supply, and these demographic issues aren't going away. We actually need automation to just get all the things done that we need to do. And then I always apply my imagination going forward and, well, actually, what happens when things get automated is that people move into doing jobs that only people can do.
I'm going to shift us away into another topic. Some thoughts, though, about regulation and how that can influence productivity going forward.
It is unquestionable that regulation is an ingredient that matters in the productivity recipe. That said, it's an extraordinarily complex topic, and it has aspects that can either enhance or hinder, let's just say, investment. And as a result, even sort of specific issues or specific regulations, if you look at them, have mixed or unclear effects. So rather than talking about regulation per se or specific aspects of regulation, it is extraordinarily important to look at potential prospective pieces of regulation and ask things like, well, what is the impact going to be on investment?
We don't kind of have a view that regulation is an unalloyed good or an unalloyed bad. We come back to what needs to happen in order to have productivity. And why do we care about that? Well, because in the long run, productivity is prosperity. That's how we share in the benefits of our technical progress. So there's a few channels that at this point in time seem a bit blocked that are important that regulators think about that. And the first one is the investment channel. So we've got to make sure the financing, the ability to build things is easy. And so I'll leave it to the listener to think, in their countries, in their geographies, is it easier to make and build stuff than it used to be, or is it harder? And then the other one is taking down all of the barriers it takes to actually diffuse this technology into our everyday lives.
Do we have the right tools still to measure productivity?
Many countries spend a great deal of effort to measure a variety of macroeconomic indicators, of which productivity is one, so that they really do have a very good sense of what's happening. And some countries do a better job than others, and in some countries it's easier than in others just because of the facts on the ground. If you shift and you say, well, okay, but what's happening at the company level? Of course, if what we're talking about is overall output per hour worked, well, that's the sum total of what's happening across all of the private sector plus government. And so, well, are individual companies looking at this? And the answer, I think, is some really are, and others are looking less at the overall output per amount of time worked, and more in a sort of more disaggregated way, certain top-line indicators and certain cost indicators. Would it help if they looked in some instances at these two things closer together? Yeah, absolutely, and it would help at the company level. And I'm curious what Chris says about this too.
Productivity is an economic concept. It's mighty hard to measure, and then you get to things, well, like how do you value better quality of life? How do you value, freer entertainment? How do you how do you value all these things? And is there a whole bunch going on in our economy that is undervalued or not valued? I look at it quite practically. Like, since we're measuring productivity in a fairly consistent way across all these countries and across all these times, whether or not you might add or subtract a little bit of productivity for these measurement issues, the cross-country comparisons still matter, and you do all of this equivocation about, are we measuring productivity correctly, does not disguise the fact that productivity has slowed down. It does not disguise the fact that it's slowed down in Europe a lot, and that Europe has major productivity challenges. And it doesn't disguise the fact that in the world that's not yet at advanced economy status, half to 2/3 of them are not converging fast enough to our productivity standards.
So we've talked about a number of different factors, including automation and technology, capital investment. I'm curious about the demographics piece. What role do demographics play in this quest for productivity?
Most parts of the world are now aging, and that means most parts of the world are going to have what's a higher dependency ratio going forward. And to support such a society, everybody working had better be generating more output per unit of labor, because they have to be able to cover everybody. There is one counterexample in all of this globally, and that is Africa. And Africa looks set, at least over the next 100 years or so, a little less, to continue to grow its workforce and have a dependency ratio that's actually going down.
There was more babies born last year in Nigeria than there were in the entire of Europe. So that's an instant telescope to the future, because it tells us what the future of the world is. The future of the world is African.
There are certainly parts of the world where aging has already kicked in and has started to mount the kind of challenge I was talking about. Japan is an example. Italy is an example. To some degree, Germany is an example. In most parts of the world, we're not there yet, but we're at a sort of cuspy place. And, it heightens the imperative for everything we're talking about.
So aging has an interesting impact on productivity. It seems that in most occupations, productivity peaks in the 40s. And we're still at a point where the median age in like the US is like whatever it is, 30, 39 or something. So we're still at a point where that's where the bulk of your workers are, if that makes any sense. Now, the average age in China is about the same now as the US, believe it or not, 39. But by the time we get to 2050, the average age in China is 51. And we'll be at a point where more than 30% of their population is over 65. In fact, China's peak year of working age population was 2015. So ever since 2015, the working age population has been in decline. So this really, really matters. We tortured the stats to try and figure out what the demographic impact on productivity was. It's too small to see at this point, but we know it's big. The bigger impact of demographics is less productivity. It's more having enough workers to go around.
Chris, you've teed yourself up properly, because one of my last questions here was around looking ahead, right? 25 years of research, actually more than 25 years of research on productivity. What's next? What are the next big issues to study beyond the demographics, which you've just discussed? What are the key questions that MGI will be looking at around productivity?
So when it comes to our productivity agenda, there's 3 or 4 things that really matter. The first one is, obviously we've identified in this report a very simple and essential focus that a pro-productivity world is a pro-investment world. So what does that going to take? And, we're seeing signs of life in the US. So like, for example, construction in manufacturing in the US is up 3 or 4 times its pre-COVID level. And, this AI thing we keep talking about, by the way, that's not just a bunch of smart people sitting in a room tapping on computers. This is concrete and silicon and energy in massive proportions. Another really important angle we look at in MGI is what's the globalization and what's the future of globalization. And one of the kind of background radiation or the background features of this time was unfettered and highly cooperative global trade. This is a time when trade grew at 2x GDP. And this was massively productivity enhancing, and by the way, very good for inflation too. But in an era where global cooperation is more questioned, now it's not going to disappear because the world can't work. We can't work without each other. America imports 83% of its chips. China imports more chips than it does oil, and Australia can't even make a car, right? So the world can't work without each other. This idea of, let's decouple, that's nonsensical.
It's amazing stuff. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but thank you, Olivia, and thank you, Chris, for joining the podcast today.
Thanks. It's always fun to talk.
It's a real pleasure, Roberta. I hope people dig into the report and give us some feedback.
Next up, we hear from McKinsey senior partner Tania Holt. She says ethnic minority employees are the talent to fill jobs in Europe's tightening labor market. Tania, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Tania, historically, what has Europe's relationship with inclusion been?
When you think about Europe, it has a really long history of inclusion. And that inclusion has placed Europe as a leading region on income inequality, social mobility, and social progress. Amongst other factors, this inclusion has actually benefited the companies that have been operating in Europe, as they have had access to a healthy and a well-educated workforce. But with this research, what we're really saying is that there is a scope for Europe to go further. And that scope really includes pursuing the inclusion of these ethnic, cultural minority communities, which makes up roughly 10% of the workforce across Europe as a source of talent. We actually believe that this group could be a source of closing that talent gap and therefore be a potential growth driver for companies.
Talk to us about the labor market in Europe. How tight is it at this juncture?
So firstly, if we look at the data for EU 27, plus Switzerland and Norway, it shows that the region experienced labor shortages overall. If we look since 2020, the vacancy rate has increased by 70%. This means that in 2022, we had 6 million vacant jobs. So that's the data. The second thing that we looked into is the executives' perception. And so we do a survey where we ask executives, what do they experience as the barrier to growth in their businesses? And last, when we did this, labor shortages went straight up to the top 3 barriers.
Mm-hmm. So it's at the top of the executive agenda. Are there particular jobs or categories of work that are proving most difficult to fill?
We looked both at what we call in the report low skill and high skill occupations. So we take the low skill group first. We saw that some of the job with the highest vacancy rates, elementary and personal service workers, and that make up 6.4% and 4% respectively. The second group of jobs that we looked into also see significant vacancies, in particular in the tech sector for individuals with software skills. Overall, we actually found that approximately a fifth of the vacant jobs in Europe are jobs that requires tertiary education. Now, what we also found here, which was interesting, was that the ethnocultural minorities are currently underrepresented in these professions, and that's actually despite of the fact that the group has similar levels of higher education attainment. And so that's often a bit of a surprise to people.
That is a surprise. So what then is inhibiting employment among these populations? Are there particular barriers that you would call out from the research?
Yes, we conducted a survey of nearly 4,000 employees in 5 countries across medium and large publicly traded companies. So the ethnocultural minorities in our survey were twice as likely as their non-minority peers to report facing obstacles when securing the right employment opportunities. They cited perceived discrimination based on cultural background as amongst the leading reasons, at a 22% points higher than non-minority employees. The second challenge we experienced was then the challenges when they are in the job and they're looking to advance within that particular job. 54% of the ethnic cultural minority respondents reported that they had missed out on a career advancement opportunity, such as a raise or a promotion. And they reported that the ethnic background were the second most cited barrier for why they had missed out on that particular advancement. Now, finally, the third thing that really stood out was inclusion. And so here we saw that the ethnocultural minorities surveyed were 2.5 times more likely than non-minority employees to report facing biased behaviors and microaggressions on the job. And some of the examples that came out were being confused for someone else of the same ethnic minority.
What are some immediate steps European leaders could take to get rolling on what you described as this triple win opportunity?
Is really about having a robust ethnocultural minority inclusion strategy and having that strategy be driven by data. We did an outside-in analysis. 72% of the largest companies in Europe don't actually have a strategy for this particular group. So clearly, the first step for many companies is to sit down and put a strategy. You know, I also said data was important, and it's often cited as a barrier, as all the various executives, of course, want to make sure they are GDPR compliant. And so there we saw that some of the companies that succeed with really looking into the data and use that data to put the different inclusion initiatives together. The two that we've seen had a lot of impact is employer resource groups, which are essentially where you put the ethnocultural minorities together and provide a safe space for the group to engage, have conversations, and come up with initiatives. And the second thing that makes a real difference is having targeted sponsorship programs and leadership development programs that are made available to the ethnic cultural minorities. And having anti-bias and inclusive leadership training available for all managers in the companies makes a real difference to the experience that the ethnocultural minorities are having in the workspace. Now, the third thing that would make a real difference is actually cross-sectoral engagement across the companies. Many of the companies are very keen on engaging on this in forums through their associations because they realize that they are early on in the journey. And one of the things that we know makes a difference when organizations are early on in the journey is that they have an opportunity to share learnings with each other.
Tania, you say that this is an opportunity, but exactly how did the research reveal that this is an opportunity?
Executives really believe that talent shortages are key drivers to slowing down the growth of their companies. So we tried with this report to put a number to this perception, and we estimated that if they hired ethnocultural minorities to address the skill gaps that they currently have, this could contribute to an additional 120 billion euros to the EU 27 GDP annually. And out of the 120 billion euros, 50 billion euros would be driven from the higher profits for the companies. The second benefit that we think about here is really about economic empowerment. So here we size that 70 billion euros out of the 120 billion is really driven through ethnocultural minority employee wages, which are empowering them and their households. Last benefit we think about is really, zooming out to the broader economy and society at large. And here we think about the wider benefits that social inclusion and reduction of inequalities that can create many, many secondary benefits. These are then also the communities that thrive at large and where we have productive and happy members of our society.
Tania, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was lovely.
Thanks so much for listening to the McKinsey podcast. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
Find us on McKinsey.com. We'll have a transcript of this episode up shortly.
And download the McKinsey Insights app, where you can find this podcast and other helpful content updated daily.
If you enjoyed the show, we'd love for you to leave a rating and a review.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.